Welcome, everyone. Hello, I'm Lisa Ames, CMO and operating exec here at Norwest. I'm going to be your host for today's webinar, featuring my esteemed colleague, the greatest, the one and only Lori Tennant. As a principal at Norwest, Lori heads our people advisory function, and she's going to tell you more about what she does in that role in a second. And for those of you not familiar with Norwest, we are a global venture capital and growth equity investment firm with $12.5 billion in capital under management. And our latest fund was raised in December of 21 of $3 billion. And we take here at Norwest a multi-stage, multi-sector approach to investing, partnering with seed companies all the way to pre-IPO across three segments, including enterprise, consumer, and healthcare. So as part of the portfolio services organization where Lori and I sit, we both work closely with companies day to day in the trenches. And our mission is to partner with them to give them the coaching, support, resources, insights, empathy that they need to build enduring companies. And these are the kind of companies in my mind that thrive not only from a bottom line perspective, but companies where employees love to work. So we're really excited to have all of you here today to discuss the findings from our 7th annual People and Talent Benchmarking Survey. We've been fielding this survey for many years, and this is just the second time that we're sharing the findings more broadly. It used to be just the companies in the portfolio that participated in the survey, and we got such great feedback that we said, hey, why don't we share it with the entire portfolio? And now taking it to an even broader audience by sharing the findings with our ecosystem. And so on the call today, we've got active portfolio companies, of which we have over 250 at Norwest. We've got alumni companies on the line, and hopefully some future portfolio companies. So we welcome all of you. And just a few housekeeping items before we get started here. So the session is being recorded, and we will share the recording along with the slides in an email probably tomorrow that'll come from Lori. And we invite all of you to submit your questions using the chat here or the Q&A module in Zoom. And I'm going to try to answer contextually relevant questions as we proceed through the slides. So if I miss them, apologies. We'll also have time at the end for additional questions. And then you can keep the conversation going even after the session by reaching out to Lori at ltennant@nvp.com. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori, and she's going to take us through, we're going to talk through the findings together, but maybe we can kick it off, Lori, by sharing a little bit more about your role with the audience here.
Sure. So nice to see all of you on this call. So happy to have you here to present these findings too. I have been with Norwest for about 8 years. My role here is I am head of people internally. And with an outstanding team that helps us internally. And then I work with our companies on all sorts of HR people advisory type things. I've been in the HR startup ecosystem for more than 15 years. And I noticed one of the participants on this call, I have known for all 15 of those years, Dawn. Hello, Dawn. She and I have worked together in various capacities throughout those years. So that's pretty awesome. So I'm fortunate to work with our companies in various ways. Sometimes I'm working with the people lead, sometimes with CEOs, kind of all things HR, anything from org structures to total rewards, a lot on DEI, company culture. As everyone in HR knows, we've been very busy in our function in the last 3 years, navigating COVID, remote work, return to work, longer lasting effects of the pandemic that are still unfolding. And so I do a lot of work with all of us with our ecosystem of people leads, kind of trying to figure all that stuff out at the same time. So this is our survey. As Lisa said, we've been doing it for 7 years. It's gotten a little bigger, a little better every time. Pretty excited. We get some really good insights for how companies are structured, are tackling challenges, keeps us abreast of things that are changing as they go. It's also been super helpful, I think, for our companies to be able to share with each other. HR, as many of you know, and the CEO role also can be a lonely role where you don't have a lot of people at your company necessarily that you can bounce things off of and talk talk about. So it's a really good way for our companies to understand what other companies are doing. So you want to go to the next slide, Leah. Yeah, there we go. So we conducted this survey last summer. We sent it to 121 of our 165 of our North America-based portfolio companies. 121 companies participated, and we're excited to share the results.
Well, and Lori, you didn't do the math for folks, but 121 out of 165 is 73%. And what that tells me, it's evidence that people really find value in this data. It also speaks to the strength of our partnership, in particular, your relationships with our companies. So I think this is a phenomenal, as a marketer, it's a phenomenal, what we call conversion rate. But again, I think it speaks to the value of this content.
Yeah, that's awesome. The other thing I think to point out, as if we can go back one slide, Leah, sorry. Kind of the elephant in the room on this slide is that we conducted this last summer. A lot of things have changed since then, as we all know. I think in the results, we'll see some of how things were starting to soften a bit, but not entirely. And we'll kind of talk about some of those things as we go through the results.
And one thing for the audience to note, I'm Lisa, and we also have our colleague Leah on the line who is helping us with the slide, the slide presentation. So didn't want you to think that Lori was mispronouncing my name.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. Cool. Okay. So these were of the 121 companies who responded. They're represented, pretty representative of our portfolio, a lot of enterprise B2B companies, a lot of consumer companies, a lot of healthcare companies, and all various aspects of healthcare. Most of our 44%, I guess the largest portion, are in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, but we have people kind of peppered throughout, a lot in the Northeast as well. And one statistic I found super interesting on this slide was that 9% of our companies are fully remote, so headquartered nowhere, or I guess headquartered everywhere. Last year, that number was 4%, so significant uptick. In 2019, that number was 1%. 1% of our companies were fully remote, and now it's 9%. Again, surprising no one, but still pretty interesting.
Okay, so let's get into the takeaways here. We're going to cover the key takeaways, the big highlights, and we also encourage you, as I mentioned, we're going to be sending the follow-up email, and we're going to have a link to a landing page where we've got the takeaways as well as like a deeper dive into the details. So there's 70 pages in the detailed deck. So a lot more insights than what we're presenting here, and really encourage you to dig into that, because I think it can be helpful in informing your planning as you go into 2023. So if we go to the next page, we'll kick it off here with talking about comp increases. So actually, Lori, this slide surprises me a little bit given the state of the economy now and the number of companies that I work with, that I know, or that we both work with, that are trying to conserve cash and extend their runway. I actually thought more companies would be planning to cut back on comp increases. What's your take here? And, and I'm actually really, hopefully you can dig into this idea that of 27% don't have a floor for bonuses.
Yeah.
So there's sort of this relationship between the comp increases and the bonuses, and maybe even a slight disconnect there.
Yes. So I think this is a great example of one of the areas where, even though this was July, which wasn't that long ago, I think this number of companies who are going to remain not going to have comp increases this year would be even more, because as you said, our companies are really trying to conserve cash. So I expect the number to be lower than 76% here a few months later. So, and regarding the revenue target, I think it's a surprising number of companies that don't have a revenue target floor before bonuses start to pay out. And to me, I think this reflects that bonus plans were typically put into place a couple of years ago. They tend to be, you don't redo your bonus plan certainly every year. That would be a way to demotivate your employees for sure. So bonus plans tend to stay in place year over year, where where comp decisions are a year-by-year decision. So I think that this probably reflects the kind of market that we've been in for a number of the last few years, where it's been so competitive for talent that and companies have had, have been in a better cash position, that they haven't, imposed any kind of revenue floor. It's not a practice that we generally recommend. I think we'll probably see more revenue floors being imposed on the bonus plans as time goes on, and as our companies are trying to make sure they have enough cash to outlast the recession. The next slide, Lee, if you don't mind. I think this is a good example of kind of the level of detail that we are able to collect in our survey. And as Lisa mentioned, we pulled together what we think are some kind of key insights, and that's what we're presenting. Love to hear any insights that any of you come up with if you read through all 70 pages. But so what this slide shows here, 27%, it's the second bar there, don't have any kind of revenue floor, but then another 12% do have a revenue floor just for executives only. So further detail. And then the slide on the right, 60% of our companies offer bonuses to all employees. So we think this will continue to be important as retention of employees becomes increasingly important over the next couple of years. It's something we'll talk about on future slides as well.
Well, yeah, perfect tee up there. This slide speaking about employee flexibility. And here we're measuring a number of paid holidays that companies provide, which is, obviously one indication of a benefit or flexibility. So I guess one thing that I'm wondering about as I look at this is that, when you spoke a minute ago about the war for talent, and we're talking here about employee flexibility being table stakes, it's required, it's expected by employees. If we zoom out a little bit and we think about, well, what are the requirements of the table stakes? Why are we even having a table stakes conversation about employee flexibility if we believe, or if the media has led us to believe, that the war for talent is over?
Yeah, such a good question. And it's one that a lot of us have been researching, discussing in depth, and is the war for talent actually over? Unemployment, as I'm sure we all know, continues to be at a historic low of 3.7%, historic low. 4% is considered to be full employment, like the economy humming along at full employment. So unemployment is still really low. Some of you may have seen a recent publication by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics that there's 1.8 jobs open for every one person seeking employment. That number could be kind of debatable because it's hard, I'm not sure how solid the 1.8 number is. It could be, companies leaving job recs open for a long time because they don't want to close it because they're afraid they'll never get it open again, things like that. But still, significantly higher number of jobs open than we have employees. And so the question is then, how do you reconcile that with, all the information we get, the media information about RIFs, which are largely in the tech sector. And, it's interesting. We hear a lot about RIFs. We hear a lot about RIFs in the tech sector. The actual number, the real number of layoffs that have occurred year to date is not that high when you look at employment in the overall country. So as of November 15th, there were only 60,000 people laid off in the tech sector, which I'm sure it's higher now. There's been some other layoffs announced, but still not as high, I think, as the media would lead you to believe. People in the tech sector are also very employable, tend to be highly comped. So, there's some belief that the rifts and downturns in the tech sector are not really out of line, or not really having a big impact overall on the war for talent. Interesting nerdy statistic that I recently heard that I like is that in the S&P 500, 36% of the companies in the S&P 500 are tech companies. representing only 0.3% of the workforce in that same S&P 500. So again, hugely profitable companies, highly comped employees, probably, highly employable. I know this is not comforting for people who have been laid off, but I do think that the media kind of overblows the overall situation when you look at the broader economy. I also recently read in Charter magazine an interview with Tim Ryan, who's the U.S. chair of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I thought he had a really interesting perspective on the war for talent, which is he says, yeah, the war for talent is over and talent won. And he talks about kind of supply and demand of the labor force. So on the supply side, the supply of labor in the US and North America is diminishing for a few reasons. The aging population, I think we've all been aware of that. Also declining enrollments in college and diminished immigration over the last 6-8 years. So the supply of labor is diminishing while the demand is actually increasing. A lot of jobs created by a lot of investments that are being made, especially by the current administration, a lot of onshoring. I just read that Biden was in Arizona yesterday at a facility that Taiwan has committed $40 billion to build semiconductor chips in Arizona. It's going to create 10,000 construction jobs, 10,000 tech jobs. So his thesis is that the supply is diminishing, the demand is growing in the U.S., and that this is going to be a continued kind of chronic war for talent. Interesting, but still, did you want to say something?
Oh no, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, it's interesting. But in any case, whether or not you believe the war for talent is over, retention is still critical. A lot of our companies that have done layoffs that are conserving cash, have riffed down to kind of their essential functions, essential employees. So even if you don't believe there's still a war for talent, I think most companies would say that employees that they have now are super critical to retain, especially if they've done downsizing, in order to be able to move forward successfully.
And Laura, we have a question here.
Yeah.
And this is something I think you're going to address in the next slide as you get into the data, but I wanted to tee it up before you get there. Our attendee is asking, for smaller companies who aren't ready to do a bonus structure, what are other ways we can think about retention in a market when we're trying to conserve cash? Yeah,
great question. Great question. So let's go ahead and so retention is important. That was kind of my point on this. But let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And some of these things do cost money. I think what we've found and what this data also shows, and I think what's been increasingly true, is that flexibility for employees is, table stakes. We've paid holidays have increased. Paid parental leave, those are not inexpensive, but they're not less expensive. But by contrast, it used to be hosted lunches. For your tech firms, when employees came into the office, hosted lunches were a big and expensive perk. But I think generally, if you can offer flexibility in terms of work from home, in terms of some companies have a kind of work from anywhere for a month type situation. Flexible hours, employees can work flexible hours. We'll see even more on a subsequent slide, the employee expectations for flexibility about when and where they work. Oh, here it is right there. Thank you, Leah, has increased. So the thing that I found so interesting on this slide, and you have to do a little bit of math, but it's 55%. If you look at question number 30, 55% of companies expect that more than, so it's the bottom two bars on that right graph, 55% of companies expect that more than 50% of their employees will be fully remote, which is astounding to me. 3 years ago, fully remote might have been on the list of flexibility, things you could offer your employees, but it was kind of rare. And now, on the other side, you can see 34% of our companies have added fully remote options. So that's a place where you can certainly be competitive. Employee expectations are super high for wanting or hopes and desires for wanting a flexible remote work arrangement. But a lot of companies aren't keeping up. So if you have the ability to do that, it can be a competitive advantage. There was a recent article in the Washington Post that said, 50% of job applications on LinkedIn. So it's on LinkedIn, people who are applying for jobs on LinkedIn, 50% of those applications are for people who are looking for fully remote jobs. The percentage of fully remote jobs that are posted on LinkedIn, 15%. So huge mismatch with what employees are hoping and expecting and what companies are providing in most cases. So while the statistic of openings to applicants of jobs to applicants is 1.8 to 1, it's actually reversed when you look at the fully remote statistic. There are 2 applicants looking for fully remote jobs for every 1 fully remote job that's open. So that's one way that I think you can continue to be flexible or offer flexibility that won't have huge costs. And in fact, you can save money actually, right? With office space and office supplies and all of that.
All right. So this next insight here is we see the chart here that shows the cost per hire, or hiring costs per employee. And you can see, oops,
You're thinking ahead.
I'm thinking ahead.
You're always thinking ahead, Lisa. That's what we
yeah, so it looks, when we say the headline here, smaller talent teams needed, I think folks are bringing their recruiting resources in-house, and that makes sense because it's more cost effective to do so versus outsourcing. And so you might say here, well, they're growing, but how does that fly in the face, Lori, of the fact that there might be a retraction, or there is a retraction in hiring? So how are these resources going to be used going forward?
Yeah, so I think this is another place where it might look slightly different now, 4 months later than it did in July. So you can see companies have been steadily moving towards hiring more internal teams, all the way up through 2022. But hiring slowdowns that we're all looking at. Slower hiring pace, I think, for sure, at most companies, not all, but most companies, if not layoffs, mean that those teams have faced reductions as well. So we've seen a move towards more internal recruiters as those recruiters are potentially downsized because the hiring numbers are getting smaller. We're also seeing more outsourcing. And we're working with contract recruiters. And another reason that internal teams, I think, had grown in prior years when hiring was so competitive is that it was difficult to even, as many of you know, difficult to even find recruiters. Lisa, you know this from some of the jobs that we worked on here internally.
Oh, that it has changed dramatically in the past few months in my experience working with portfolio companies, because it was like I would have, work on several open searches at a time, and it was always a scramble to try to find a recruiter to take the work on. And now the recruiters are calling me, even from a leveling perspective. So there was a firm that I've worked with a few times only on executive searches, and that was their niche. We just do executive searches and wouldn't even go below senior director. And now, I'm hearing from some of them saying, hey, what searches do you have? And I've said, well, I have, this director level search or whatever, and they're more willing to take that on than they were even 3 months ago.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to continue to see that. I'm sure I'm not the only one on this webinar that my inbox has the number of recruiters reaching out and staffing companies has, of course, taken an uptick. So more signs of the times.
All right. So cost of living adjustments. This is kind of a hot topic because it affects so many people. And we talked earlier, Lori, about fewer companies planning to offer comp increases in 2023. Yet I'm sure many employees, especially in these times of inflation, still think that a cost of living adjustment is sort of a bare minimum requirement. But this slide seems to indicate that's not the case. So, are there going to be a lot of disappointed employees come Q1 or whenever the annual review cycles occur that sort of thought, oh, well, I'm maybe it's going to be 9%.
Unfortunately, I think there are, and that's for a couple reasons. One is, of course, affordability for what companies are, again, conserving cash. But what I think is more significant is that the inflation rate has actually dropped fairly significantly since the high of the summer. In June, inflation was 9.1%. I imagine, I know for my own self, until I started actually doing the research, I assume that's kind of what it was still. You're starting to hear a little bit about inflation dropping, but I think the story in the media still talks about high inflation. 9.1 was the number that stuck in my head. As of October, inflation's down to 7.7%. And more importantly, it's forecasted to be around 5% by Q2 of 2023, which is down to 2021 levels. So I've been hearing for a while, actually, from comp consultants that a lot of companies were not factoring in the current inflation rate. I heard that a lot, and so much that it surprised me. I think the continued drop in inflation just kind of, underpins, or I'm not sure the word I'm looking for, but it kind of reinforces that practice, where I think we're going to see not very many. I think we're going to see pretty much for companies that are doing increases. I think it will be flat year over year.
Is it an either or, Lori? Is it like, do companies tend to either do a cost of living or, performance based?
That's a great question, because not all companies even break it out. So, and I think in recent years, increases have been around 3 to 5%, inching up toward 5%.
Performance based, right?
Well, all together.
Just everything together.
Yeah. And it's been inching up towards 5, I think, in the last couple of years, where, the war for talent is heated up. But a lot of companies don't break it out. So it'll be 5% altogether. And I think, since probably 2008, when we started to really see a change in how companies were doing increases, inflation just wasn't something people necessarily thought about. COLA was around 2, maybe 3%. So it was just kind of baked into an increase. Companies, the average increase nationwide was around 3%. That took inflation into account, and people just didn't think about it that differently.
Yeah,
but again,
on the radar, because inflation hasn't been an issue.
Exactly. And then when you start seeing inflation of 9%, which I know a lot of people, especially if you commuted and you were, driving and paying gas, it really hit them hard. So
right.
That's why you have started to even see it discussed so much.
So maybe in employees' minds, they look at it like, well, I've historically gotten 3%, and that's fine, but now I'm going to get 5 or 6 or 7,
right?
Because the way, in their minds, the company is basing their adjustment on performance. So then they want an extra kicker for the inflationary pressure.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think if you can go to the next slide, we did a little survey on LinkedIn that shows exactly that. So, and I think what I've heard some companies do a really good job of addressing with their employees is that, yes, we know inflation hit you, but it also hit us. It hit our bottom line as a company. We're concerned about not only your expectations and rewarding you and retaining you, but also affordability, what we can actually afford to do this year and maybe even next year. So this slide, I think, definitely reflects the fact that even last month, November, the inflation news in the media was so top of mind that 43% of people were expecting a COLA adjustment, and 11% probably unsure but optimistic.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, this is something that I think has changed.
So pivoting slightly to a new topic here, learning and development. So this finding surprises me a little when you look at the chart here. You see a big bump of employers planning to increase their investment in L&D, going from 33% last year to 47% this year, which represents a 42% increase. So very significant. What do you think the link is, Lori, between L&D and then in employee retention? Because this is, I think, a theme we want to touch on throughout this session today. And why is this important right now?
Yeah, and this is another place where we see the tension between, affordability and what's necessary to keep and retain a productive and happy workforce. We're happy to see the increase, right? Because it's super important, especially in a remote and hybrid workforce, right? If people are not in the office that much, you want to make sure they're not getting that kind of organic shadowing or stewardship training that they would get from sitting in an office with someone. You want to make sure that they're getting what they need to be successful and help you be successful. It's important for a scaled down workforce because you might have people who are doing new jobs that they haven't done in the past, right? You want to make sure that they're equipped. And then, as you say, Lisa, it's a really important attraction and retention tool. There was a poll in 2021 that Gallup did that said L&D is one of the top perks that employees look for. So I am imagining again that this number might be one of those numbers that you see decrease in recent years as companies are focused on expenses, focused on reducing their burn rates so they can outlast the recession with especially if they're pre-profit or not, or just barely profitable, conserving cash to outlast the recession. But there are a lot of good, I think, affordable online options for training that hopefully we'll still see investments in.
Well, one question in my mind is, from an employee perspective, is to what degree do you have data to suggest, or do you believe that employees take advantage of these offerings? So, if I'm given, hey, here's, you LinkedIn Learning or whatever, access to
Udemy,
a portfolio company. Thank you. How, to what degree do employees intend to, they value the benefit, but, to what degree are they using it and taking advantage? And you may not have data on that. I'm just curious from your perspective in your experience.
Yeah. I have data just from I have anecdotal data, right? I think it's really variable. I see some employees who take advantage of lots of different options to expand knowledge for their work, or maybe there's something else they want to, learn that doesn't even have to do with their current job. So it's quite variable. I think, again, I think this is something that hopefully with people not commuting as much, and if they're wanting to, learn new skills, if they need to learn new skills, I'm hoping it's something that employees will start taking more advantage of. But what I've seen, again, anecdotally, is sometimes it's super important for employees that they have the option.
Mm-hmm.
They don't always take advantage of it as much as we would hope.
One thing I've done is to incorporate, with my team, is to incorporate L&D into their goals, right? So it's like, hey, take a creative writing course or, whatever, as part of your goal for this quarter. And I find that that's an effective strategy for motivating them to take the action, because there's always an intent and like, oh, I really should do this. And there's a desire, but sometimes it's hard to make it fit. And if you incorporate it as a goal, it becomes more actionable, I think.
Yeah, that's an outstanding idea. I think also it gives employees, the permission that if they're, taking a class on something like creative writing or project management, I've recommended people take project management during working hours, that they can, they can rest assured that they're not just taking advantage of a perk, but they're actually, something that you want them to do and you're happy to pay them for.
And as we're trying to encourage employees to come back to the office too, another angle could be to use your commute time to listen to courses or audiobooks on certain topics that they want to freshen up on, because it feels like, we've gotten so used to, I know I, as an employee, use my commute time to just work more and do more stuff.
Yeah.
And and it hasn't necessarily served me, versus now the days that I do go into the office, I use that commute time to listen to, to improve my skills and my knowledge.
That's a great idea. Yeah, I think a good plug for public transportation here as well, especially if you're able to take public transportation. There's a lot of good, audio, video stuff you can do.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I just, totally different topic, but you just said you used your commute time to just work more, right? Which I think has been
During the
so,
pandemic.
yeah, which I think has been so common. I think that's what we all did. And I find that commuting, even though it's, for me, 45 minutes to an hour in each direction, I'm more energized than I am when I spend that time still sitting at my desk working at home. So it's interesting. It's another one of those things that I can't wait to look back,
Yes.
10 years from now on, what were the short-term impacts? What were the long-term impacts? I mean, again, off topic, but I always reflect on the fact that if someone had told you in March of 2020 that you'd be home for 2 years, it was completely unimaginable. I remember talking to people about, it's going to be 2 weeks, which also felt unimaginable. We felt like at Norwest that we were being, really forward thinking, and we were saying, oh, it's going to be till May, May of 2020. So, so it'll be super interesting to look back on all those impacts.
Totally. We're going to have to do a lot of experiments and research and studying on the impacts along.
Yeah, super fun.
So if we go to the next page here, this topic is really near and dear to my heart, not only because I come from an underrepresented group, being Latina, but also because I help drive our ESG and DEI efforts here at Norwest. And, as a firm, we've always believed that, the key to building successful companies is by hiring people with varying backgrounds and perspectives, making those people feel like they belong. And in this case, as we're talking about today, being an integral part of an employee community. And, give us, Lori, a temperature check, I guess, in evaluating the data we see here, where we've got, a large percentage with no goals around recruitment of DEI candidates. But at the same time, we have 75% of companies that are prioritizing DEI initiatives. So I want to, based on that, these seemingly conflicting, at first glance, conflicting data points, I'd like to get a temperature check from you on, evaluating the data we see here. And my question is, as I look at this, are we doing enough as a collective, we to draw a through line between DEI initiatives and successful company building?
Yeah, those are great questions. So first of all, the recruiting goals, I think it's just one program. So while only 1/3 of companies have, specific recruiting kind of metric goals in mind, that's just one of many programs that you can and should have around, diversifying your workforce. And in fact, with companies downsizing, it's probably a less important goal. Recruiting, candidates from whatever groups are underrepresented in your industry, in your company, is less important than actually retaining them, right? So retention, again, back to our theme, retention's so important. Retention of your diverse candidates is I think especially important for the same reason that you wanted to, that you felt it was important to bring diversity of thought, diversity of background, diversity of experience into your company for better business outcomes. It's just as important to make sure, if you are a company that's downsizing, that you're still maintaining that diversity in your workforce that you work so hard, hopefully, to build. But Lisa, you raise a good point. I think that there was a time when there was a lot of talk, kind of in the beginning of when DEI started to get more national attention. There's a lot of talk about, not a lot of talk. There were studies that were cited about the better business outcomes, especially on boards when you had a diversity of thought, of experience, of backgrounds. I don't know if you hear about that as much. It's another thing I'd like to probably, double click on is, because I think there have been a lot of studies, but it's probably not necessarily as top of mind for people anymore. But let's go. Can we go to the next slide, Leah? Thanks. So this kind of talks about what the programs we have in place. So DEI, I'm happy to see, is still remains important. It's a high priority for many of our companies in 2023. We still see our companies investing in training, really important. ERGs, inexpensive, also important. It will continue to be important, as I said, for the same reason, that you wanted to build a diverse workforce in the first place. It also, if you are hiring, you may have the opportunity to hire people that it might be easier to diversify your workforce if you actually are hiring. But I think most importantly, it's really important to keep an eye on the I in DEI. Retention, so important, as we say, for these times, and increasingly important to make sure that all of your employees feel included, feel valued. If you're not focusing on recruiting goals, if you have ERGs, make sure that they know that their role and that it's valuable. If you can do any training, super important. So I don't think that people are taking their foot off the gas necessarily, and they shouldn't be.
I just don't think they know enough. I
Mhm.
think, to your point about training and investing in that, super critical, because when people don't know what to do, they tend to do nothing.
Right.
And so the more you can infuse this learning and this, for people to understand the benefits of these initiatives, I think it's important. I think most people will, if they don't understand, they won't raise their hand and ask, like, hey, I don't really get it. What are these studies that show we create better outcomes by investing in DEI? So they tend to like, oh, I don't really know the answer to that. So I think I'm just going to put my head down and keep doing my work. Yeah. And so the more we can open up those conversations and show people the proof points, here's the data that that demonstrates why this is important, and to keep a steady drumbeat of that education, I think that's critical, because it's so much easier to revert to what you've always done rather than to lean back a little bit, come at this situation from a different altitude and shift your perspective. That takes a lot of work, and it's easier just to keep rolling.
Yeah. In life, that's true of all of it. Inertia is a powerful force, right? This is a great opportunity to showcase our DEI toolkit, which I wonder, Leah, I wish I'd thought of this before, if we could put in the chat the link to our DEI toolkit. And if not, we can send it out later. But we have, many of you probably know, we have a lot of different tools and templates and perspectives on how to focus on DEI in your company, many of which are not high cost. So
and it's a pretty fulsome set of resources, luckily. And one of the things we're doing is investing in a lot of enablement for our companies to be able to absorb this information, use this information in productive ways so that they don't click the link. And so I just want to warn people, when you click, and we want to share this, when you click the link, there's a lot there, and it could be potentially overwhelming and like, I don't know where to start. And that's why we're producing events and webinars to invite companies in to really understand what's available to them as part of this toolkit, and then more importantly, how to use it. So maybe what we can do is not only put a link to the toolkit in there, but maybe the replay of one of the initial enablement webinars we did. And then we've got something upcoming as well that we can promote.
Excellent. So Leah, I'm sorry to put you on the spot because I know you're trying to drive the slides at the same time, but we can certainly send out, when we send out the recording to all the participants, we can include a link to that microsite. Oh, there she is. And it is an internal for portfolio companies. So
And
Thank
so we have a couple questions here from our attendees. So for the companies that had DEI recruiting goals in place, do you have insight as to the average percent representation increase that they are trying to hit year over year?
I don't. That's a really good question. That would be a good question for probably a follow-up survey. And I think the answer will
Or another
also
LinkedIn survey.
another LinkedIn survey.
Oh,
Yeah, I think the answer will really vary based on your particular industry. You know, there's some. Um, I think the definition of who's underrepresented in your industry might vary based on your industry. So, but that would be a good follow-up. Thank you, Leah, for providing that. Sorry to make you scramble.
and then we have another one going back to our L&D topic for just a sec. It seems like the responsibility is on the employer to, one, provide the benefit, two, encourage people to use it, and three, offer them recommendations to take it. Are you seeing a shift in the responsibility of an employer to do what seems like everything to an employee without any accountability on an employee's end, like i.e. self-led, or is this level of support what's required now? Oh, and then the person saying this is not specific to L&D, but seeing this trend in general around benefits and career development. So self-led versus, really being enabled and encouraged to take advantage of these resources.
Yeah, I feel like the kind of underlying question here is around how much are employees expecting us to kind of handhold them and hand feed them things. And you can read a lot of stuff that will say it's a generational thing. I don't know the answer to that. Do you have a thought about that, Lisa?
I think it's, from my perspective, it's both. And that's why as a leader and in the way I manage, the folks that I work with is I'm going to come to the table and I'm expecting them to come to the table too. And then like going back to that example, that's why, it's like, how do I get them to, invest in their own development? Well, I can't just lean back as a leader and expect them to do all the work. So I'm going to come with some suggestions and enablement strategies to get them to lean in and help themselves. So I personally think it's both.
I think it really varies also based on who you're hiring. I mean, those of us who have hired people right off campus, that's a different development task as a manager than when you hire someone who's got, a number of years under their belt. Wholly different. I remember when I first started my career it was Anderson Consulting at the time. Now it's Accenture. And I mean, I got guidance on how to dress, which sounds a little bit weird, but you actually, for some people who'd never worn suits before, which we did back then, you really actually did need all that guidance. So I think depending on, kind of what level of people you're hiring and how much time they've spent in the workforce, that level of kind of direction and what could feel like spoon feeding will vary. One of my favorite management techniques is Ken Blanchard's situational leadership, where there's, some of you I'm sure know it, there's 4 levels of readiness for being managed, and then 4 levels of, kind of manager directiveness, and someone who, that you as a leader need to match your management style with what the person needs. So someone right off campus who might need to, be told what time to show up in the morning is going to, there you go. Thank you, Leah. Is going to be need a very different management style from you than someone who's, got decades under their belt and has managed teams themselves. So I think it varies.
Yeah. Awesome.
Is there another question? Was there another question?
No, I think we got them.
Thanks for asking questions, guys. We appreciate it.
Yes, it's wonderful. And so our final insight here is, we're taking a look at expected hiring costs for our portfolio companies. So it looks like there was a dip in 2021 and hiring costs prior to that, and currently at about 5 to 10K per employee. Well, Lori, what would you say is behind this dip, and how should companies view this data from a planning perspective?
Yeah, it's also an interesting, like, what the heck does this mean? Why is it going up and down? So what we think is that, based in 2021, there was a lot of hiring going on, as you all know. So the costs per hire, costs are spread out among a larger number of applicants. So then your cost per hire is going to go down. And then in 2022, which again, I think we did see things starting to soften in the summer. You're doing less hiring with the same size recruiting team. So, and also more use of outside agencies. We started seeing more use of outside agencies at a time when people couldn't find recruiters to bring on board. We saw use of RPOs, recruiting process outsourcer, where you'd outsource your whole function. It's expensive, but it was kind of what people had to do in a time when they couldn't find enough recruiters, or even kind of contract recruiters to help. So we think with the more recruit, not great news for the recruiters, but there are more recruiters available now, right? There's more recruiters available, both for full-time hire as well as for contracting. The compensation for recruiters will likely see a decrease. We think, see contract agencies much more willing to negotiate, both, as you said, Lisa, kind of the level that they're negotiating, as well as this is a time when you can negotiate rates for sure. If you're not already doing that, if you're using any agency for hiring, this is the time to negotiate rates. So we expect to see that to kind of decrease again. So I think that's kind of our guidance, is now's the time when you can really use some leverage to decrease your costs.
And then in terms of how to measure that, Lori, we have a question from an attendee about what's the methodology for measuring this?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I will defer that and follow up to our outstanding talent team. We have as hopefully those of you in our portfolio know, we have an amazing team of six talent folks who help our companies with hiring, with negotiating contracts. They will help you negotiate your search contracts if you want, with compensation. Sorry, there's sirens going on outside. But that's a great question, how to calculate that, and we'll include that in a follow-up.
We'll take that as a follow-up, exactly.
Yeah.
And so any additional questions from our audience today before we wrap? And as a reminder, we are going to be sending this recording from today's session, as well as the slides, and a link to the landing page where you can get the 70 slides of additional deeper dive data. And if you want to keep the conversation going with Lori, you can reach her at ltennant@nvp.com. Please connect with both of us also on LinkedIn, so that we can continue to build relationships with you. And I think that's all for the questions today. I want to thank you, Lori, for the awesome work here, and to all of our attendees who joined us.
Thank you for awesome co-hosting.
Okay. Have a great day. Happy holidays, everyone. Bye.